Hello everyone, welcome to the TheGeoecolologist. I am Dr. Krishnanand, and in today's session we are going to learn about the contributions of Greek scholars in evolution of geographical thought. So in earlier lecture we learned about the building blocks of the knowledge forms that existed in the prehistoric times before the Greco-Roman times. So how those knowledge accumulated in Greek era and what was the contributions of various scholars. That's important in order to understand that these modern concepts in climatology, geomorphology and social geography and other parts of the geography, how these concepts came from the ancient. What are the roots of these concepts that we study today? So that is what the basic contributions of those particular scholars during the Greeks and Romans make sense. So let's understand some of them in today's session and some of them in the sessions to come. So before we go ahead, please like and subscribe to our channel and please press the bell icon for the updates. So before we go ahead to the Greek scholars and their contributions, let's analyze the locational importance of the Greeks. So it was located in this particular area where you find that entire area has Mediterranean Sea and Aegean Sea, also the Ionian Sea. So what is the advantage? One is the land connectivity from Asia Minor and from the northern part of Europe, and also the sea connectivity. That's why it is a favorable location if you observe. So this entire Balkan Peninsula, this Sea of Marmara and Aegean Sea area, and this entire Mediterranean Sea where you find this Asia Minor connect. So entire location, if you see, has an advantage. So when we say advantage, it's in terms of location. So locational advantage basically means that knowledge accumulated from not just the land but also from the connection with the different bodies in islands and mainlands from the sea section. So the entire knowledge accumulated in this particular region, which was consolidated as an empire by the Greeks. That's why Greeks accumulated the wealth of knowledge and also the wealth of information from all around the known world at that particular time. That is about the 8th century before Common Era. So let's understand further. So Greeks are pioneers in many branches of knowledge that we understand. Then this particular time period of about 1000 years, right from 8th century before Christ to 2nd century is supposed to be the golden time period of Greeks, and if you add Romans to it, so Greco-Roman period that's called, and it is supposed to be the golden age only because of this factor that best intellectual ferment happened in this particular time period. So development in astronomy that was coming from Assyria, geometry was coming from Chaldeans, mathematics was coming from Egyptians, and many more contributed. For example, philosophical bent, scientific attitude, inquisitiveness. These characteristics were coming from where? From Assyria and Babylonia, as we have seen that, observed that in the previous lecture. So this was accumulating, and with this, the new forms of knowledge were getting built upon on the Greek land. So that is important here. Now, the concepts about mountains, coastal areas, sky, horizon, all these things importantly were conserved and were developed in this particular time period. Then further, we see that civilizations existed before Greeks had an impact on the Greeks, and they further developed those civilizations to the next level. So the Greeks defined geography as description of the earth. That was the basic idea of geography during Greeks, right? So let's understand that further. So in ancient Greek scholarship, there are two traditions of geographical studies, if you see. So what are these two traditions? The first is called the mathematical or the astronomical traditions. So you must understand that this particular tradition, that is mathematical and astronomical traditions, involves a lots of mathematics, right? Or if you say calculations. So one thing that we say that quantitative revolution or quantification or quantitative techniques in geography we have imbibed from this particular tradition. That's why mathematical tradition and astronomical tradition is important for geographical studies. And then the second is called literary tradition. the descriptive tradition, where description matters. So if you observe carefully, all these questions that we ask in geography, right? For example, what, where, why, how, all these questions are answered in both of these traditions. So still today, our studies in geography are not confined to any single tradition. It is combination of all these. We have certain quantitative techniques as well. We have certain qualitative techniques as well. Apart from that, we also are interested in description, about distribution, isn't it? So all such kinds of traditions that began in the ancient are still prevalent as major part of the subject matter in the geographies that we study. Now let's understand how it evolved and came across. So the first important point here is to learn that Homer, about whom we are going to learn. So Homer was a very famous historian of that era, and his verses, all right, his verses were the first set down in writing around 700 before Christ. So look at this particular time period. So as art of writing was developed already during Mesopotamians, so Homer was the first person who wrote verses. All right. So as we have verses in Indian context as well, in Mahabharata and Ramayana, if you see that, so there were verses being written. But remember, writing was not that well developed. Still, it was to be developed further. At this particular time, Greeks invented their own alphabet using the Phoenicians alphabet. So phonetics coming from Phoenicians. So they had only consonants, if you remember last lecture. So after this consonants, they incorporated vowels into these alphabets and finally made a complete alphabet from the Phoenician alphabet. So art of writing was developed, and that was important here because literary tradition grew because of this art of writing. Further, these verses traveled. How they traveled? They probably had been memorized by the traveling bards. Those bards who used to go everywhere traveling and reciting those verses to people, telling stories. So that is how it traveled. And that is how the knowledge from one section of the empire went to the other section of the empire. The knowledge from past came to the present through this oral traditions initially, and gradually after the development of writing, it actually got documented. So let's understand about Homer, his contribution as a primary contributor. So first important point, if we observe here, is that it is a common belief amongst the Greek scholars that Homer is regarded as father of geography. All right. Although geography was not a subject during that time to be studied independently, okay, so people were multi-scholars. Scholars in various disciplines at the same time. So that was a time period when there were scholars who were multidisciplinary in nature. But Greek scholars regard Homer as the building block of geographical studies. So they regard him as father of geography. But in totality, Eratosthenes, that is, we are going to learn about him in later lecture, was considered as the father of geography. But according to Greek scholars, Homer is considered as the father of geography. So this is why, because of this particular reason, that his monumental work, that is Odyssey and Iliad, are the epics that we say. Like our epics, Mahabharata and Ramayana, there is no comparison as such, but epics are basically those epic books, those great descriptions, narratives about that kind of culture that existed then, or maybe about historical accounts. So those were there in these Odyssey, which was basically a geographical account of the known world of that time, and Iliad was about kingdom, about war, where the famous movie you may have seen, the Troy. So Trojan War was documented in Iliad. So if you get time, do watch that movie, or you can also read that book, Iliad. So you'll find out what happened, the struggle between the kingdoms and how it happened. So that is documented here. So because of this Odyssey and Iliad factor, Homer is considered as the pioneer of the Greek geographical studies. So his statement also says here that Earth is to be a place of circular form. So the circular Earth concept was first propounded by Homer himself, and he said that it was surrounded on all sides by ocean river. He did not say ocean simply, he said that it's like a river which is called ocean, a larger body of river itself. So that was the imagination about the ocean. Then the concept of sky was given by Homer. He described what is sky and how it looks like and what are the features of a sky. So that was interesting by Homer. Then he also described 4 kinds of winds that were there as according to his observation in the Greek Empire. So those 4 winds are Boreas, Eurus, Notus and Zephyrus. So I hope you can remember these names that are important here. B, E and Z. So if you want a shortcut, it's called Benz. So Benz is basically Boreas, Eurus, Notus and Zephyrus. So it's basically northeast, southwest. And if you want to remember this northeast to southwest, you just remember about our direction of particular trade winds that is in northern hemisphere. If you remember climatology, the trade winds blow from northeast to southwest. And when it is reversed, monsoons come from southwest to northeast. So if you want to remember that, NESW. Some people say write it NEWS if you want to write news. So that way if you remember, so then there will be an exchange. So B is basically Boreas, that is for north, Eurus is for east, Notus is for south and Zephyrus is for west. So not only he gave these descriptions, these words, but also said what was the quality of that wind. So if you observe here, the Boreas are strong, cool and clear skies wind. So when there is a Boreas wind invoked, there will be clear skies. Then Eurus is basically warm and gentle wind. Then Notus is the southern part, so it is front of an advancing storm, because storm is coming from the Mediterranean towards the north. So wind that is coming from south is bringing storm, it is violent. And Zephyrus that is coming from the west, so it is balmy, it is sunny in nature and having a gale force. So what you see here is an interesting description of that facet of climatology that is part of geography in current scenario as well. We study about the wind system in details, isn't it? So that was a great contribution from the Homer. Then we further see the contributions of a particular place called Miletus. Why is it important? Miletus, if you observe here, is a place along Aegean Sea and Mediterranean Sea. So at this particular junction, the Asia Minor section, so Miletus was a town which was well developed during that time, and it was supposed to be one of the first places where library was constructed, and all these scholars gathered there in that particular region and exchanged knowledge, and knowledge accumulated in this particular center that is called Miletus. So it is important, and Miletus was one of the largest, greatest Ionian city. So Ionia, if you observe, so Ionian city is called Miletus, and basically it is in southwestern Asia, so it's Asia Minor if you see here, and it is near the mouth of the Meander river. So remember, the feature meandering process is coming from this particular river itself, because the feature of this river is serpentine in nature, and that's where we say in geomorphology the name meander coming from this particular river. So currently this particular place is located in Turkey. Then further if we see, Homer refers to the people of Miletus as Carians. So they were called Carians, and these were the people who fought Trojan War with the Archeans Greeks. So basically these people, the Archeans Greeks, traveled to Miletus, to this particular town. If you observe these ruins, so this particular place is featured according to Homer in the Trojan War. So that was interesting. Now let's look further. In addition to its commerce and colonization, the city was distinguished because of particular reason, and that was because of its literary and scientific philosophical figures such as Thales, Anaximander and Hikitius, all those people. So these are the scholars who contributed immensely to the geographical studies. So let's look at them one by one. So first of all, the Thales of Miletus. Thales is very famous because of his mathematical tradition contribution. He was a great genius, philosopher, traveler, and also his theorems in geometry, mathematics is very famous as Thales' theorem. So he had certain observations which are listed here in terms of 6 observations. Like for example, circle is divided into 2 equal parts by diameter. This concept was given by him. The angles at each end of the base of an isosceles triangle are equal. So interestingly, this concept was given by Thales himself. When 2 parallel lines are crossed diagonally by a straight line, the opposite angles are equal. So remember some of the greatest things that were discovered and invented during that time, and geometry being one of them. So these geometrical principles were given by Thales. The angle in semicircle is a right angle. The sides of similar triangles are proportional. Two triangles are congruent. So congruency theory, when we study in school mathematics, that's given by Thales himself. If they have two sides and one angle respectively equal to, then that is a congruent triangle. So congruency. And then further, he visualized Earth as a floating disk in water. So very interestingly, this concept was an interesting concept that described the Earth. So Earth was supposed to be floating disk in water. So it was considered that it is a floating disk that is surrounded by water from all sides, and it was given by Thales. He also said that the measurement was possible, and he tried measuring the Earth and location of the things on face of the Earth, thus establishing what? The mathematical tradition in geographical studies. So that's where the contribution of Thales lie. Then not only this particular foundation was empirical in nature, so empirical studies became very famous because of this kind of observation based theory making. So ground observations became important, and that's where, if you observe, the field work in geography is still part of the curriculum in geography, and the pioneers are Greeks who said ground observations matter. So as a critique of the traditional unscientific explanations, Thales developed the kind of scientific acumen, and further more scholars came in and they contributed, as we are going to look at. So one of them is called Anaximander. So Anaximander is basically a pre-Socratic, before Socrates, Greek philosopher, and he was proponent of science and different aspects of science. He used this particular Babylonian instrument called gnomon. If you observe in this image, this is gnomon. So the shadow of this instrument, if you observe here, this shadow, it's giving you basically the time. So when this shadow is shifting on this particular gnomon instrument, you can calculate what time it is. So kind of a clock which was based on this instrument and coming from Babylon. So if you remember, Babylon was a pioneer in this kind of study. So they took it and further developed using this particular instrument. So he's also regarded as father of cosmology and father of astronomy. He had great contributions in the field of astronomy and cosmology, and he was the first to conceive mechanical model of the world. So the mechanics that runs this world, right? So Earth is a floating disk in water. How this mechanics was developed and what is the reason behind it. So he was the person who described it. He is even credited to produce a world map to scale during that time of the known world. So you can measure places and distances between places. So this map is based on information gathered from the Sumerians. So in previous lectures, as we discussed, that past had a lot to do with the present Greek scenario. So that's where you see the contributions coming in with a great value for the Greeks. So this map had something that is interesting here. If you see that ocean was encircling all around the known world, Europe, Asia and Libya, this northern part of Africa. So that is where this concept was floating, that Earth is a floating disk in water and it is surrounded on all sides by oceans. Now, next scholar is very famous. He's called Hikitius. So he was one of the pioneers of history and prose. So he is very interesting, and he wrote a book called Des Periodos, which means description of the earth, in which he described two significant parts. So what are those parts? In first part, that is part A, he described the geographical information about Europe, about places, people, cultures. And in second part, he talked about Libya, that is the North African section. So another book that he wrote was Genealogies. So genealogies was about historical account. So that is one important point that we must remember. And then further, he is supposed to be the pioneer of these approaches that further was debated during the Middle Ages and further in classical geography. That is the nomothetic and ideographic approach. That is the law-seeking approach and descriptive approaches that we study in geography in later times to come. So Hicatius is many places regarded as father of geography as well. But remember, Hicatius is not the father of geography. If you find anywhere written, it's Eratosthenes that we are going to study in further lecture. So he was probably the first of the logographers, basically those people who distinguished myth from the historical fact. They are called logographers. So he was one of the pioneer logographers before Herodotus. So who was Herodotus? Let's look at Herodotus. He is also called father of history and ethnography. All history must be treated geographically and all geography must be treated historically. This is a famous quotation saying by Herodotus. So every geography, if you want to study geography, you cannot take out history out of geography. And if you want to study history of places, you must study it geographically. So that was a very interesting concept. And if you see the start of interdisciplinary. So interdisciplinary subjects are not new. Interdisciplinary thought is not new. This is how interdisciplinary thought emerges right from the ancient Greece itself, isn't it? So Herodotus came up with the concept that Egypt is gift of the Nile, that we say famously, gift of the Nile. So it was his concept. He gave it. He emphasized on silt, mud of the river that leads to development of Nile Delta. So he talked about the description of Nile Delta in 4th century BC. So it was he who for the first time gave this concept that winds move from cold to hot places. So very interesting. In climatology, we still read this concept that from a high pressure to low pressure is the function of movement of wind. So this was described by Herodotus for the first time. And further, he also attempted to measure the age of the earth. How? Very interestingly, by actually studying the sediments. So he studied sediments and said that the age of the earth is 440 million years. So he studied the sediments and estimated, and that is supposed to be very close to the actual original, that is about 4.6 billion years. So he was not that far, even in that age where there were no scientific instruments available. So just by studying the sediments, he contributed this particular fact. So now, when we have learnt about the contributions of all these major 5 scholars during the Greek time period, apart from that, the locational analysis also we did. So what we found out that locations did matter in the evolution of geographical thought. So geography matters in terms of evolution of geographical knowledge itself. So location was prime, connection from the land, from the sea, from the ocean. This mattered. Knowledge accumulated through people after ages. So that was interesting. And also these important contributions will be further listed as subject matters. The syllabus will be made from this in the modern history that we are going to look at further. So let's understand in the further lectures to come more scholars whose contributions are important. So all the best wishes. See you in the next lecture.